Greetings, River of Life Church. This is lesson 2 of our study of Acts. And this week, we take a look at Acts chapter 2, the coming of the Holy Spirit at Pentecost. But before we do, I want to take a look at a story that Luke inserts here between our passage last week, the promise of the Holy Spirit, and Pentecost. And that is the choosing of Matthias to replace Judas as an apostle. Let's remind ourselves of the passage from last week. Jesus had called his disciples together, and he had talked to them about the priority of the kingdom. He told them that there would be a promise that they would receive, and they would receive power to accomplish the mission that Jesus was sending them on. He tells them to stay in Jerusalem, and then they watch Jesus rise into the heavens and be received by God and sit at the right hand of the Father. Jesus' disciples in this story are now in Jerusalem. This passage in Acts tells us that there's about 120 of this community calling themselves followers of Jesus, both men and women, led by the now 11 disciples or apostles of Jesus. And in this story, Luke is going to share with us how they chose a successor for Judas. I want to highlight one specific aspect of this passage, and I want to make two observations. First, let me highlight the pattern of prayer that Luke is going to point out to us. In an upper room, these 120 disciples of Jesus are gathered. The 11 are there. Jesus' family, his mother, his brothers and sisters are there. And they all gather, and Luke tells us in 1:14, all these with one accord were devoting themselves to prayer. Luke not only points out that they are praying, but he says all of them with one accord. There is a unity in which they are seeking this promise that Jesus has told them they will receive, this power. And Luke also tells us that they're devoting themselves. Luke is going to constantly position prayer with the power of the Holy Spirit in Acts. As God's people pray, as God's people seek him, what God does is he grants the Holy Spirit for the work that he has commissioned them to. So let me close with two observations from Acts 1, 21 to 26. And the first is the qualifications to replace Judas. As the disciples talk amongst themselves, they point out that there's two men who have been with them from the beginning of the baptism of John. That was when Jesus was baptized by John, until the time he was taken up from us. One of these men must become a witness to his resurrection. The disciples knew that alongside of them needed to be someone who had seen Jesus' entire ministry, because they wanted an eyewitness. They wanted a witness who would testify to the things that Jesus had said and done, would testify to his death, and would testify to his resurrection. A second observation is the way that Matthias was chosen, and that is by the casting of lots. Once two men were put forward who fit the characteristic of being a witness of Jesus' entire ministry, the question was, how would they decide between these two men? In this case, once again, they pray. They put these men in front of the Lord. They say he knows the hearts of men, and they pray. And then, like many times in the Old Testament, they cast lots. This is writing on a stone, putting them in something maybe like a jar, shaking them and seeing which rock falls out. What's interesting about this passage is this is the last time in the entire New Testament that the casting of lots is mentioned or used by God's people. The reason why is that in the very next story, the coming of the Spirit would indwell God's people permanently. There is a new age, and there is a new era about to begin between God and his people. And now it's time to turn our eyes to our study this week in Acts chapter 2 and the coming of the Spirit. The divinely appointed time by God for giving his Holy Spirit would be Pentecost, meaning 50th. It's 50 days after Passover. And on this day, God would pour out his Spirit. And the age of the Spirit and the age of the kingdom would now enter into human history. From the time of Jesus' death and resurrection, to the time of his second coming, we enter into the church age, the age where God gives his Spirit and enters into a new covenant with his people, a covenant to take out their heart of stone and to give them a heart of flesh. God will be working in a new way. And just as he had a people in the Old Testament, Israel, who would be his witnesses to the nations, God will now be working through his church, those called out of the world, those called into the kingdom to follow Jesus, and those who will be sent out into the world with the power of his Spirit. God's blessing on your study this week.